Climate change is worrying in a way that the needs are getting different.
Конечно, очень хочется, чтобы жизнь вернулась в поселок.
Covid-19 pandemisi özellikle dezavantajlı grup olarak adettiğimiz Suriyeli mültecileri de çok derinden sarstı.
Our support is still needed.
Climate change is worrying in a way that the needs are getting different.
Конечно, очень хочется, чтобы жизнь вернулась в поселок.
Covid-19 pandemisi özellikle dezavantajlı grup olarak adettiğimiz Suriyeli mültecileri de çok derinden sarstı.
Our support is still needed.
Hello, good morning. Good morning if you're here with us in the room. Hello, whatever time of the day it is, if you're watching us elsewhere around the world. We know it's the middle of the night in the US where one of our speakers is joining us from, so we'll be delighted to see you later, and courage. This first session, it's part, of course, of the first ever European Humanitarian Forum. My name is Cathy Smith. I'm going to be the moderator. We have interpretation in French and English, should you need it. English is channel 1, French is channel 2. Please do tweet. It's hashtag EU Humanitarian Forum. We're going to be using Slido for asking questions, so that's also for people here with us in the room, but obviously if you're watching online. Everyone, I think, very familiar with Slido these days. So we will have a Q&A session later. If you like a particular question, then you can tick it and it will go further up the list and has more chance of actually being asked. And so you can see that the code is hashtag EHF-AB. AB is the name of this room. So do try and ask as many questions as you can. So we're talking about here aid under fire, protecting humanitarian actors and fighting against impunity. And the statistics are really grim. In 2021, there were 86 major attacks on humanitarian and medical missions. 65 aid workers died, 28 were kidnapped, 85 wounded. And these are not just statistics, these are people. And you may know some of them personally. It's a massive issue. So we want to talk about how to safeguard the humanitarian space, also to fight against, how to fight against impunity for the people behind these crimes. So we've got an hour and 45 minutes. It's quite a long time for a session, not necessarily long enough to come up with definite solutions, but we can actually move on towards some recommendations. And of course, the process has already started in terms of the discussion series that began last year on this. So we want to build on the outcomes of that today and move towards potentially some sort of action plan. Let me just run through very, very quickly the recommendations that came out of that discussion series in the outcomes document. I think a lot of you will be familiar with it, but it said that there was a need to prioritize compliance with international humanitarian law and respect for humanitarian principles, a need to build a more standardized and comparable monitoring system for the safety and security of humanitarian and medical workers. And I think we'll find that data is one issue that we'll talk about a lot today. Humanitarian organizations, including local ones, need access to information and resources to enable effective security risk management. And integration of security risk management is needed at all stages and all programs and mandates using a risk-sharing approach. the whole kind of risk appetite and risk sharing, again, something that we will talk about. And there's also a need to address the effects of sanctions and counter-terrorism measures. So those, just quickly to run through the recommendations. We have a very impressive panel. I'm not going to introduce everyone now. I'll introduce people one by one just in the interests of time, but they're all really coming from a different perspective and can all potentially fill in a new piece of the puzzle for what we're talking about today. Obviously, security is really key for humanitarian workers. And we want to start by looking at a video of the work of UNDSS, the UN Department of Safety and Security, providing safety and security services to enable the UN to deliver its programs globally. Let's have a look.
In Syria, a whirlwind of division and bloodshed.
Culminating in a humanitarian catastrophe.
Suspend military action, end the violence, uphold the rule of law, and recognize the right of return of all those who had to leave the country.
So there you are, a taste of the work that's being done by the UNDSS. And Under-Secretary General Gilles Michaud was hoping to be with us, couldn't be at the last moment, but we're delighted that speaking on his behalf, we're going to be joined by the Director of Specialized Operational Support, Esther Couche-Laroche. I think, Esther, 3 o'clock in the morning or something in New York, where you are, but thank you so much for joining us. And the question that we wanted to ask you is how UNDSS supports the protection of UN personnel in carrying out its work in areas of armed conflict. What are the emerging challenges and what more can be done? And bearing in mind the outcome document that we're talking about today, how you can build on that, what recommendations you might have. So Esther, delighted to see you.
Thank you so much, Kathy. And distinguished panelists and participants, good morning to all of you. It's indeed a very early morning here in New York, but I'm very happy to be with you and to participate in this forum. I'd like to start by thanking the European Commission and the French presidency of the Council of the EU for inviting us to participate in this important panel. And thank you very much, Kathy, for the excellent questions. On how UNDSS supports the protection of UN personnel carrying out humanitarian works in armed conflicts, I'd like to highlight 3 points. First of all, security has to be a key enabler. In increasingly complex settings of armed conflict, the UN applies a security risk management approach to really reduce the risks that UN staff face to acceptable levels. We know that zero risk does not exist, but the aim is really to reduce the risks to an acceptable level. And the aim is always to enable and not to inhibit UN personnel in delivering critical humanitarian aid to people in need. And we try to do this by applying effective security risk management measures that include coordination and notification, specialized equipment, training for UN personnel, and effective communication procedures. And of course, we also work very closely with all of our different partners. Some of them are sitting on the stage today. And this approach enables the UN to carry out life-saving humanitarian operations in conflicts or high-risk locations from Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, to Niger, Ethiopia, and of course, Ukraine, among others. UNDSS increasingly provides strategic and specialized operational security support. For example, our physical security team develops and shares expertise that helps the UN family to design and construct more secure infrastructure. In the past few months, our experts have brought this advice to the UN in northern Mozambique, for example, Libya, Somalia, just to name a few. At a more strategic level, we lead and direct the UN security management system, known as the UNSMS. And this unified system brings together more than 50 UN entities, as well as non-UN international organizations, to better enable all UN operations in conflict settings. The second point that I wanted to highlight is effective security risk management is multidimensional. That means it really cuts across different UN pillars. And when security personnel have a seat at the table during programmatic and operational planning processes, such as the UN country team, the humanitarian country team, or UN missions, then we see two key benefits. First of all, we embed security in the engine room of UN operations as a key enabler and not as an afterthought. And second, we integrate security risk management into broader risk management, where security and other risks often overlap and need to be addressed together. In today's evolving security context, we really strive to embed people-centered security risk management with this multi-dimensional approach, based not only on physical security measures, but also on forward-looking security analysis, data-based security management, access negotiation, engagement with non-state armed actors, and also acceptance by the communities that we serve, among others. For example, in 2020, we supported at least 61 field missions in areas of very high risk, including 34 missions in Yemen, 24 in Somalia, and 3 in Syria. The last point that I wanted to highlight is that the UN security must continue to evolve. Now, within UNDSS, we really have realized that any evolution must apply not only to our tools and approaches, but more specifically to our mindset, which is a shift really from one that conceptualizes the sole responsibility of security personnel as to protect, to a mindset in which we come with security solutions to really enable the UN to deliver even in the most challenging environments. And for us at DSS, a more diverse workforce will underpin our own evolution. We acknowledge that we need to open up our recruitment processes to those who can bring talent and perspectives from a wider range of professional backgrounds, and more diverse teams have proven to understand risk more holistically. Now, you also asked me about emerging challenges, so let me perhaps turn to two of those. First, the global security environment in which we operate is unlikely to improve in a generation, unfortunately. To meet the security challenges of operating in a complex security terrain, we must ensure that security forms an integral part of planning, budgeting, and implementing stages of all the humanitarian programs. Secondly, recalibrating our security approach requires both rethinking and resourcing. For example, updating UNDSS's security data system to establish a real-time, reliable security information platform and strengthen analysis, which will benefit all of us in this forum. And that requires specialized expertise and resources. Now, on what more can be done, including in implementing the recommendations in the outcome document, I'd like to focus on two things. Firstly, increasing collaboration among different entities on existing security data platforms will benefit all of us in the humanitarian community. UNDSS is committed to enhancing our collaboration with member states and non-UN partners on best practices, knowledge sharing, and capacity building measures to make this a reality. Upgrading the security data system and information management is really one of our pressing needs, and one that will yield benefits not just for the UN, but for all of our partners. And secondly, we fully support the recommendation on the integration of security risk management at all stages and in all programs and mandates. Security support in crisis responses to enable humanitarian work in armed conflicts requires predictable available resources, particularly in search capacity of personnel and equipment. And this is now more critical than ever, as we've also seen in Ukraine. In our joint efforts to translate into action the recommendations on security data system and the integration of security into humanitarian programs in crisis responses, UNDSS stands ready to collaborate with all member states and partners on how to progress with concrete steps and needed additional resources. With the international community's resolve, we hope to be able to move forward together in realizing the outcome document. The security of our humanitarian personnel depends on it, so nothing could be more important. Thank you very much for the questions, Kathy, and delighted to be here with you.
Thank you so much indeed, Esther, and very clear that security needs to be an integral part. Yes. Thank you. I mean, your points that, that security needs to be an integral part of planning of missions and that there needs to be good data for analysis, really, really important points. And the fact that your work is very much to enable and certainly not to inhibit. But thank you very much for starting us off so in such an interesting way. So that sets the scene, really, to move on to our next speaker, because we're going to now hear from a donor and state perspective, Anton Les Garcia, who's the director of ACID in Spain, the Spanish Agency for International Development Cooperation and Humanitarian Assistance, which is responsible for the coordination of the whole of Spain's humanitarian aid. So the question that we're asking Anton is, well, I mean, we know that Spain actually is very active in working on this issue, working on a national strategy on the safety of humanitarian workers. So how can states act in a global way to include some of the outcome document recommendations? Anton, you can stay there, Anton, if you'd like. Okay.
Well, thank you, Kathy, for the question and the panel, and special thanks to the French Presidency and the European Commission for gathering us physically here today. After 2 years working at home, I think it's about time that the humanitarian family meets again to discuss these issues at such an important moment. We all know the backdrop. This forum takes place at a particularly dramatic context in the midst of the greatest humanitarian crisis that Europe has had to tackle in decades. This crisis, unleashed by the illegal, illegitimate, and unjustifiable war launched by Russia in Ukraine, is going to keep humanitarian agencies such as ourselves busy for months to come. I'm just back from a trip accompanying to our minister to Moldova and Poland, where we announced the largest humanitarian response in the history of Spain to a single crisis of this nature, where I had the chance to discuss with frontline humanitarian actors on some of the needs and challenges they are facing, including on security. As you know, these 2 years of pandemic have seen a clear deterioration of the humanitarian situation all over the world, with growing needs and a growing financial gap. In an already dire situation, this has made things all the more complicated for humanitarian workers. And Kathy, you mentioned the figures. Only last year we lost 65 people to violence against humanitarian workers, including one Spaniard, Maria Hernandez, a worker for MSF in Ethiopia, and 2 of her colleagues. We have to understand that the topic of our discussion today is a prerequisite to any humanitarian action, since, as obvious as it may seem, there is no possible humanitarian action without humanitarian workers. Spain, as a member of the UN, as a donor, as a humanitarian actor, understands this simple statement, and we understand that this is not just a nice principle. It is our international obligation according to the 4th Geneva Convention to protect the humanitarian space. That's why we committed to the protection of humanitarian workers and the fight against impunity. Our first national strategy for humanitarian diplomacy will be released in the coming weeks, has 3 main goals and 13 pillars of action, and many of these pillars are linked to this issue, the question of security of workers, and describe the work we've been doing to protect humanitarian workers. These pillars of action are also in line, by the way, with the recommendations of the outcome document discussed in the discussion series held last year. Some of these principles, like first and forefront, is the protection of humanitarian space. And in that regard, we are paying specific attention to the effects of regulations on it. We understand in this context that sanctions and restrictive measures often create new and unnecessary risks, and that's what we feel strongly, that they need to be targeted, they need to be accurate, and they need to be individualized to prevent damages on the civil population and humanitarian actors. All sanctions regimes should also include humanitarian exemptions commensurate with the humanitarian activities that need to be put in place. Likewise, anti-terrorist laws should not erode the humanitarian space. For the last 10 years, we've seen in Syria probably the clearest example on how sanctions can interfere with humanitarian action on the work on the ground and the work of humanitarian actors. And we've heard complaints from many of them on the negative effects on the population and the restriction of the humanitarian space. We do important advocacy efforts to promote the elimination of such barriers, and as a director of an agency that deals with both long-term development assistance and humanitarian interventions, I can say that we also try through the development work to enable more enabling, more accurate, more solid regulations in our partner countries by enhancing law enforcement and institutional capabilities. But while most of these barriers are, if you want, collateral damage, some of them are actually deliberate. And that's where it becomes more concerning, where these restrictions have the intention of stigmatizing or even criminalizing humanitarian partners, affecting not only the efficiency of their actions, but also threatening the physical integrity or freedom of humanitarian workers. Honoring the humanitarian principles, all actors have to be able to contact any given non-state actor and act in any given place to attend every beneficiary in need. And these regulations shall be the target of our both public and private diplomacy. But even without sanctions, access of personnel and goods to humanitarian contexts is often complicated, difficult, dangerous. And as donors, we need to maintain a contact that is constant with partners to understand their needs and ease such access restrictions or difficulties with the tools at our hand. And that's why Spain has been a strong funder and supporter of enhanced flights as a way to guarantee safe access to remote humanitarian contexts. And I think that's something that many actors thank us for. It's probably not the most visible intervention, but it really makes a difference in some of these contexts. Secondly, this strategy that we were putting together includes as one of the three main goals to foster respect for humanitarian law. Of course, this goal does not apply to the protection of workers only, but this is probably one of the main cornerstones. In particular, our strategy develops a pillar to the protection of medical missions and basic health services. And you all may know, Spain promoted the adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 2286, which condemns the attacks against hospitals and medical workers. This is particularly urgent in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, as the likelihood of these attacks has increased from Syria to Afghanistan, and we've already seen what happened in Ukraine with the bombing of a hospital under the excuse of being a shelter for militia troops. Our main focus in this sense is to continue developing effective early warning systems to prevent attacks. I think Esther was referring to it. Data is absolutely fundamental. Data collection, compilation, and analysis mechanisms. And with that in mind, we've been co-designed and funded an innovative project of the International Peace Institute, the IPI, that will examine ways to increase the utility of current data collection mechanisms and systems in place, including political and technical feasibility of developing a UN-managed database that will combine, harmonize, and standardize available data on attacks and threats against medical and humanitarian personnel, as well as obstruction of medical care in armed conflict. This database, we think, could help the UN system and membership to be informed of the challenges and risks incurred by medical and humanitarian personnel in armed conflict, to better prevent and protect the latter from threats, violence, and obstruction. Other recommendations include the exchange of good practices between states and international organizations, Esther also alluded to that, to improve national prevention systems, or enhancing accountability through the informal group of friends of UNSCR 2286. Accountability in the fight against impunity is not only mentioned in our strategy regarding the protection of medical personnel, but also in many other aspects. The international system already provides instruments to investigate and hold perpetrators accountable and eventually guilty. However, we understand these mechanisms have gaps, have shortcomings, and we have to act upon those. Among other things, the International Criminal Court has to be reinforced as the cornerstone of a universal system for the prosecution of international crimes, while we keep collaborating with the United Nations in enhancing commissions of inquiry and fact-finding missions. This goes hand in hand with supporting the work of the International Humanitarian Fact-Finding Commission and promoting its full operability. It is the responsibility of the international community and individually of each of our states, but particularly donors, I would say, to work on these issues. And that's why these considerations regarding the ICC and the IHSFC are among the international commitments that Spain made in the 33rd International Conference of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent movement. Finally, and above all, let me conclude, as donors, we have a duty to speak out when attacks are carried out. We need to do that. We need to use every ounce of our influence, political and otherwise, to press the parties to respect international humanitarian law and to protect the humanitarian space. Unfortunately, as we see in the news almost every day, today more than ever, we need to defend the humanitarian principles, and on that you can count on Spain. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. And Anton there talks about reinforcing impunity by, for instance, reinforcing the powers of the International Criminal Court. We're going to look now at legal aspects with Antonio Mulvi, who is the founder and executive director of Legal Action Worldwide, LAW. I like acronyms that are neat like that. Antonio, she's an international lawyer, former UN investigator, has advised and investigated on war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide. And LAW as an organization, a lot of you will know it, but it helps people and communities who have suffered human rights violations and abuses to obtain justice. So the question that we have put to Antonio is, how do you support accountability for attacks against humanitarian workers? And does she have any examples and lessons learned? So, Antonia, you can stay there to speak or you can come here.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Good morning, and thank you for the shout out for our acronym. I like that. It's a great pleasure to be invited onto this esteemed panel, and thank you to the hosts. Now, last year, Legal Action Worldwide provided legal information to more than 30,000 individuals and represented 800 before national, regional, and international courts and tribunal. All of them had suffered from human rights violations and abuses in fragile and conflict-affected areas. Many of those crimes, violations, amounted to international crimes. Now, when law was established, we were bridging the gap between developmental and humanitarian actors. 100 experts came together and looked at what the gap was, and they identified that creative and high-quality legal services were missing for individuals in complex humanitarian areas. And so we came together. We're mainly women lawyers and jurists working on the front lines, and our senior management have humanitarian backgrounds. Now, when I was coming here today, I was trying to think about the issue, and unfortunately, it reminds me of the difficulties and challenges we face when providing assistance to those who've suffered from conflict-related sexual violence. Firstly, the fear to report and where to report securely. The fear of retaliation and security issues. We can't really understand the scope and the scale of the problem. And legal systems that are not fit for purpose and not delivering justice. And where does that lead us to? Well, there are increased attacks, as we heard, on humanitarian aid workers. And in 2016, OCHA said there's so few statistics on those who are held accountable that there's no official record. Where are we in 2022? I don't think much further. And of course, that breeds impunity for the perpetrators and silence for the survivors and victims. We represent some humanitarian aid workers, and also from our research, we found some other challenges which I think will be familiar to those on the panel. There is also reluctance to take legal cases because fears it may impede their operations or their access. But we also know that cases are sometimes taken against the NGOs themselves and not against the perpetrators. So we want to shift that aspect of it. Because, of course, it serves the attackers if we don't undertake legal accountability. So we want to shift that spectrum, and of course it increases instability for the civilian population that we are there to assist. So we need to be ambitious and innovative, so I've come up with some suggestions for consideration. Now, the first one, and we heard it also, I think it's in the report and some suggestions, we need an independent, secure reporting system. Aid workers need to be able to report these violations and abuses and have referrals attached to it. Legal services if they wish. If you don't report, we can't respond. Secondly, we need a deployable, rapid body of investigators. I've been a UN investigator who are sent to assist NGOs to collect evidence and to store it securely for that moment when justice may be able to move forward. We don't have to look far. There are models that we can learn from. The International Independent Impartial Mechanism on Syria is doing just that. We also need free and high-quality legal information, assistance and representation to aid workers, but also to their families. And it has to be independent from the NGO that they are working for reasons that I think we've set out and we'll hear from. But we also need to ask, what kind of justice do aid workers want? Justice takes many different forms for many different people. From those that we have represented, some want the state held accountable, some want compensation, and we should not underestimate the impact it can have on people's lives from a long-term perspective, and shouldn't be frightened to fight for that. Some want acknowledgement, apologies, they want the truth, what happened to their loved ones, and some want criminal prosecution. So, also, what we need to do is to share information. And I'm going to give you, we talk about this a lot, but what does that really mean? Well, I'm going to give you quite a concrete example. Just last month, on the 8th of February, we filed a case against a state on behalf of victims and survivors that we represent very grave violations. Their allegations against the military of that state. Well, there were 3 humanitarian workers that were killed last year, and the allegations are against the same military. We suggest if we could have further information, we could attach the testimonies and evidence to our current case and to other cases that we are working on, including, for example, victim submissions that we've made on the situation of Syria to the ICC. So we need to be better to share that information. But also, what's in our toolbox already that we can utilize? And I would offer there's quite a lot. I'm afraid we can't limit ourselves to looking at violations of international humanitarian law. We need to look much more broadly. We need to look at the national system itself, where the violations and abuses have taken place. That's our starting point. What does the civil and criminal law offer to us? What is the nationalities of the victim and the perpetrator? We take cases in extremely difficult situations in Somalia, in South Sudan, in Lebanon, and we are winning some of them. If we don't test the system, it won't move forward. But then, if we cannot use that system, or if we have exhausted it, we turn further afield. International human rights law can help us, international criminal law can help us, and the UN system can also help us. So we need to think creatively, and we need to think outside of the box. And finally, let us not forget who are the main victims from the information that we have. Many of them are national staff. And many of these attacks are not actually conflict-related, they're criminal attacks. So we can't have different layers of protection of the staff who are providing this assistance. And we may need to, again, think about how can we help them to come forward. Sometimes we need to offer them the possibility to protect their identity while undertaking a legal case. We're undertaking this right now. We represent 25 South Sudanese women who are subjected to mass rape, gang rape, and sexual slavery. The allegations are against the military. We are arguing before UN CEDAW mechanism to protect their identity so they can come forward, and also so more victims and survivors to come forward. So I think we have a number of tools in our toolbox, and I think if we start working together more, we can start to change this narrative, reduce the impunity for perpetrators, and hear the voices of the victims and survivors. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. Can I just ask you, Antonio, I mean, you talk about this fear to report and the silence of victims because they think possibly it might reduce access to situations. I mean, does that bear out in reality? I mean, is there some sort of payback if people are complaining about attacks?
Thank you, Kathy, for that question. I think there may be some others who'd be better able to respond, but certainly for the humanitarian aid workers that we've represented, they really had great difficulties to come forward and to speak about what happened, and they were very worried that they would not be employed again. So I think we have to tackle this a little bit more, and I would love to be able to work with some of the humanitarian organizations. How can we cross this road, and how can we help them to do it? Because we recognize the difficulties that the humanitarian organizations have, but human rights organizations or legal organizations don't have the same difficulties.
Right, okay, thank you very much indeed. Well, if you have any questions on this, please do start to send them, or on any of our speakers so far. So in the run-up to this forum, there were regional consultations on protecting humanitarian and medical workers, and Iman Ismail is the director of the International Council of Voluntary Agencies for the Middle East and North Africa region, and she's going to run through some of the key messages that came out of the regional consultations and put it really into the context of the experience of the ICVA. So delighted to have you with us. Are you going to stay here or stay there and talk? It's easy.
That's okay, I can stand up for a change. Thank you.
Okay.
Good morning, everybody. Assalamu alaikum. It's a great pleasure to be with you all today, and it's great also to be joined and to be joining colleagues in the panel to be participating. Key messages and inputs came from the regional consultations. I think the first, remark that the safety and security of humanitarian aid worker is not like a standalone subject. It's strongly intersects with the issues that we have discussed yesterday about humanitarian access and the international humanitarian law. Also comes very strongly with strong ties regarding how the EU and member states expected to do more regarding putting more pressure, diplomatic and political pressure, on the fact that we need to address the root causes of the issues, which is ceasing the fire, ending the conflict. And then we have a safe environment for the people whom we committed ourselves to serve, and then for the aid workers as well. In addition to the fact that, that we have the EU and member states also needs to continue and increase their support to all of humanitarian agencies so they can strengthen their security risk management, and they can also have more investments regarding the info sharing that we heard a lot yesterday and also early today, to invest more on the security infrastructure and, practical speaking, to empower and strengthening the capacity of the local actors who are the frontliners facing also huge risks on the ground. So I wanted to start with this quick intro and here a few elements on the key messages and recommendations came from all humanitarian agencies. The first one is related to the duty of care. We often hear this word, but I'd like to always put emphasis that this is a moral and legal obligation. And we need to unpack what that really is related to our shared responsibilities as humanitarian actors. And the fact that organizations need to undertake the duty of care as a moral and legal obligation to ensure the health and safety and well-being of humanitarian actors, and underline under the word well-being because it's always underreported, considering how it's also how local actors, humanitarian aid workers are facing tremendous pressure and stress working in volatile situations such as Syria, Ethiopia, Yemen, and you can count it. Humanitarian agencies need resources, training programs, security and risk infrastructures, informations that can be provided in a timely fashion where humanitarian agencies can build and take informed decisions based on the information that is available in a transparent manner as well as in a timely manner. The second point that I'd like also to share, it came from the regional consultation loud and clear that humanitarian agencies need to have a role in any mechanism put in gathering information. So not to have them as a negative recipients, but to have really engaged in establishing a real-time alert system, info sharing that goes both ways, so collating info from the people who are in the field and then receiving other info. These information are critical for the safety of the people whom we committed ourselves to serve, in addition to the safety of aid workers. Not to forget, we need to include local NGOs. Usually, we are prioritizing including them in every single project activities. There are certain reservations about including local actors and certain questions about what extent they are affiliated, less affiliated, principled actors, not principled actors. Including local actors is not an option. This is a country where they know better certain risk, and whenever we ask them to go upfront and implement on our behalf, then we need to include them in any info sharing mechanism to ensure that any alert info systems are built on reality check and built on data gathered from the people in the country. Also, I'd like to have a point regarding the data and how EU and member states are really expected to use this data for advocacy purposes, putting more pressure on national authorities, armed forces, providing evidences about certain attacks and evidences, and use it for a strong targeted joint advocacy case, asking for more safety and safe corridors for humanitarian aid workers. The second point is also regarding risk sharing. I heard this word a lot yesterday about how risk sharing, not shifting the risk to any implementing partners, should be the case, and the approach should be built on a respectful, meaningful partnership based on equity. And to be very genuine with you, realistic speaking, how we can develop equitable partnership when the power is not equal. There is power imbalances. So we need to be aware that building equitable partnership, it's two ways, it's shared responsibility, and building equitable partnership also where EU and member states can ensure that partners are supported to implement risk mitigation strategies that focus on access and security, and it's part of the implementation of any humanitarian response programs, not necessarily considering a limited side of it when we consider certain support and certain budgeting costs can put in any agreement. This is part of it. It's not the whole, let's say, elements related to focusing on risk mitigation strategy. So the EU and member state is asked and is expected to focus on mainstreaming risk mitigation strategies within any humanitarian response and not to limiting that within any certain support cost. Also, we've talked yesterday in different panels about showing more flexibility in delivering humanitarian assistances, picking certain geographical areas over the others, prioritizing certain action over the others, trusting how humanitarian agencies reporting on certain incidents. So, in a summary, the integration of security risk management at all stages mentioned very clearly in the outcomes and also in the consultation, and not to have it as part of ticking the box.
Thank you very much indeed. Some really sort of strong points. Have you?
Thank you. I have
one more point.
One more point. Thank you. Coming from MENA region, where we have different examples of remote partnership, cross-border operations related to Syria, other also remote operations from Tunisia to Libya. So many examples about also how remote partnerships, exporter operations put more pressure on local actors. And there is always a question in my mind as a humanitarian worker. I'd love to call myself this name. It's a privilege. It's proud for me to consider myself a humanitarian worker. To what extent we are asking ourselves, are we overwhelming the local actors in asking them to continue to do more and scaling up their operations? Are we asking ourselves that local actors and partners can scale up their operations while retaining duty of care responsibilities that can be similar to how international actors also focusing on the duty of care? And I'd like to conclude by saying that I referred to this very quickly about the well-being of a humanitarian aid worker. It's not like a black and white. It's either life-saving or the death. There is in between the psychological impact on humanitarian aid workers. So to what extent we are offering certain services for humanitarian aid workers who are working in a very volatile situation and needs for debrief sessions, psychological counseling, or certain free services offered and be in confidence conducted for those who can be very much impacted by certain kidnapping incidents or other exploitation or other harassments or other detention experiences. I know very well that so many NGOs suffered from different incidents for detention or being investigated on certain elements with authorities. And what about all of these experiences? So this is also a call for the EU and member states to continue supporting such initiative, continue strengthening and supporting local actors and INGO on establishing all of these mechanisms. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. Some really important points there that I hope we've got time to discuss, because this whole idea of the local actors being in the front line, that you talk about risk sharing and the power imbalances and the risk of overwhelming local actors with the demands that come their way. So thank you very much indeed. So let's now talk to somebody who has got workers out there in danger in the field, Jean-François Riffaut, Director General of Action contre la Faim, Action Against Hunger. I think you started in France, but I know you're working worldwide now. So really the question that we're putting to you, Jean-François, is, well, we know that you have had workers targeted in certain countries, so how can you carry out your work, ensure the safety of your staff, and what would you recommend to boost the protection of humanitarian workers in the field?
Thank you, Cathy, for this question. I don't know if I will be able to answer precisely to your question, but I will try to bring some response, but also some ways to tackle this issue of disrespect of international humanitarian law and threat aid workers. First of all, I would like to thank the European Commission and France to organize this important conference yesterday and today. And I would like to propose you to look for a map of hunger, of food insecurity. And once you have found a global map of hunger, I would suggest you to look for a map of conflict, a global map of conflict. And you will certainly see that they quite easily match. If you put the map of hunger on top of the map of conflict, or vice versa, you will see not a lot of difference. And I will also suggest you to look for a map of threat on aid workers. And you will see that the three maps look quite consistent. In a nutshell, it means that fighting against hunger is being in conflict areas, but is also taking a lot of risks. And in order to protect aid workers from risks, which is not a purpose in itself, the purpose in itself is to bring support to people in need. So please, let's accept that it's a transitional goal to protect aid workers, because if we can't protect aid workers, we can't deliver aid to people. But the main element to protect aid workers is IHL. Does IHL exist? It exists. It has been existing for years, for so many years. Does, I would say, new element supporting IHL exist? Yes. There is dozens of resolutions from the Security Council, but not only, that recall everybody to respect IHL, to implement IHL, to enforce IHL. So IHL is a shield for us, but it's a shield which doesn't work as it should work, because it is disrespected. And so the way I look at this situation, it is the way I would like everybody in the chain of solidarity would look at it. From the citizen who pays his taxes, to the chief of government who organizes the public policy of his country, through the donor agency, via the UN, up to us on the ground. I would like everybody in this chain who would think about people needs and staff care. People needs and staff care does not belong to NGOs. Of course it belongs to us. We are the frontliners. ACF, we are operating in 50 countries. But we can't afford to carry this charge alone. We need to be sure and we need to feel that throughout all the chain of responsibility of human solidarity, and not only humanitarian action, but human solidarity, coming from the chief of states, passing through the citizens, through the donors agency to the NGOs, we are all engaged to enforce IHL. It is not the case at the moment. We have been attacked in Nigeria. We have had staff killed in Nigeria. We still are hoping for the army that killed 17 people of our staff 16 years ago in Sri Lanka does not remain in impunity. So we know what we are talking about. We are talking about proof of deep IHL violation and disregard of so many actors in the world about that. And I really thank you, Antonia, for what you said and for what your organization said, because it gave me hope. I'm very sincere, it gave me hope. Otherwise, not otherwise, it's not a good word, sorry. Even though we are in a, I don't think that we are in a no justice area. We are operating in countries where the education on IHL is more than low. But we are also financed and supported by countries. And so we have to dare to say that. We are also disrespecting IHL. So breaches, violation, attacks, threats on IHL, hence on head workers, of course, they come from the very countries where we operate, from the non-state armed groups, from the states, from the regular armies, from individuals. Of course, it comes from there. But it also comes from those who found the aid. Deciding to ask NGOs to screen final beneficiaries and putting that in the policy of the aid agency of the country is a violation of international humanitarian law. So when France government decide to ask all NGOs taking money from France aid agency to commit to screen final beneficiaries, is a violation of international humanitarian law. It puts us at risk. It opens a door which is a very bad door, because it's a door that no other country opened yet, but it's a door that put every of us at risk. Why? Because above or next to IHL, there is impartiality. So impartiality, it is the second shield that we have on the ground. And it comes from the very specific individual singular level when the imam of Alindao in Central Africa that I met 10 days ago, he understands what means working for action against hunger. He understands that we look to everybody as people in needs and not according to his faith or to his origin. But impartiality goes through to the top of states, of chief of states and governments. So impartiality is acceptance. In order to support our acceptance, we need to remain impartial, and we need not to be forced not to be impartial. According and alongside with what you said, Antonia, through concrete proposition, the main idea is promote, prevent, and prosecute. Please, impunity. There is tools to prosecute. There is tools to prosecute. We need NGOs together. If the states don't want to do that, if the international community is not able to do that, let's do that alone, NGOs. So I'm asking for principled NGOs as ACF together and to organize a concrete, operative task force to monitor, to denounce, and to prosecute at every level, every violation of international humanitarian law, whether it comes from countries where we operate, whether it comes from countries that fund us. We also have to denounce the politicization of aid, because it weakens our impartiality. And I would like also to suggest that, and may I thank the initiative announced by Commissioner Lenarčič yesterday. We need such initiative in terms of supporting and enforcing IHL, but we also need to have concrete propositions. So here one concrete proposition. We need a preliminary analysis of IHL compliance for every regime of sanction that people would like to develop. We can't afford to have regime of sanction which are violating IHL, because it's illegal, but mainly because it puts us at risk. So you understand, and I finish here, sorry, you understand that we are facing humanitarian crisis, but we are also facing what I call a law crisis, legal crisis, a crisis in terms of respecting of rights, in terms of respecting what is already written. And this is a moral crisis, because what is already written reflects what we have in our hearts, what we want to change. And so we have to fight also against this moral crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. So a very, very passionate plea there from Jean-François, and at the heart of it, the idea of getting NGOs together in a task force to denounce and prosecute every violation of international humanitarian law. We will potentially talk some more about that later, but thank you very much indeed for that. Our next speaker had hoped to be with us, but unfortunately she has COVID, but we are delighted that she has recorded a message for us, because we've already talked about how data is such a key element to analyse levels of safety and security. And Christina Viller is the director of the Insecurity Insight and Aid in Danger project. That's a project that collects data on any event that interferes with the delivery of aid. So we're going to hear from Christina now, and she's talking specifically about Ukraine because she's looking at the current trends and challenges in terms of attacks on humanitarian and medical workers.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it is with much regret that I can't be in the room with you today, as I'm forced to self-isolate due to a COVID-19 infection. I would like to thank the organisers for the opportunity to speak all the same from my hotel room, as I would like to share a few thoughts with you regarding attacks on healthcare and the challenges for the aid community to address these issues. These are images from the Maternity and Children's Hospital No. 3 in Mariupol, Ukraine, after it was bombed on the 9th of March. These are some of the human faces of what aid under fire can look like for health workers and women about to give birth. Over the past 12 months, Insecurity Insight has observed a weaponization of healthcare in conflicts in Myanmar, Ethiopia, Sudan, and now Ukraine. Weaponization of healthcare occurs when health facilities are the targets of attacks. Medical neutrality is obliterated and international humanitarian laws are violated to restrict or prevent access to care as a weapon of war. We all know that bullets, shrapnel, and falling debris from destroyed buildings kill in war. These are the war casualties we count. We also know that violence leads to excess mortality or indirect deaths. People who die from injuries, illness, and complications that could have been treated if only the health system functioned at full capacity. Weaponization of healthcare, ladies and gentlemen, refers to the targeting of health workers, ambulances, and hospitals with the tactical intention to raise the indirect and excess mortality through destruction of a health system and by making people fearful to seek healthcare. Attacks on healthcare can target international aid agencies providing vital services. Most of the time, however, the targets are local health workers and local hospitals, not directly linked to our international aid system. Yet these tireless health workers are providing the frontline first aid. The health workers who have come under attack in Myanmar, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Ukraine identify first and foremost as citizens of their country rather than aid workers. And they have come under attack because a regime or conflict party deems them sympathetic to the cause of assisting injured civilians. In our modern world of social media, these health workers can speak directly to us as never before. For example, David Beckham handed over his Instagram account to Dr. Irina in Kyiv to let her talk about her work. And she tells his 71.5 million followers about her experiences, bringing this straight into the homes of many people. Now, to maintain access, international agencies adhere to the humanitarian principles of neutrality, independence, humanity, and impartiality. These concepts are vital and the basis for humanitarian aid. They should be untouchable. Yet, local health workers witness and experience what are probably war crimes and crimes against humanity. They do not only want to provide care, they are calling for accountability. They look to the international community for aid and support, in particular as their own association, employers and trusts are usually ill-equipped to provide them with security risk management or evacuate them to a third country when violence escalates. They feel badly let down when concerns about humanitarian access means that the international community does not act in ways of support they feel they need. It is, of course, a delicate and very difficult balancing act to address attacks on aid while seeking access through impartiality. But there are ways to do it, if we collaborate to connect the dots. For example, Insecurity Insight, with the support from ECHO, works together with the International Rescue Committee of connecting voices from affected countries, integrating data from the World Health Organization and the International NGO Safety Organization, among others. We are working to connect the dots, and we're putting this information out without associating operational agencies. This requires trust and partnership. The challenge, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to put in front of all of us is that we find more effective ways of working together to address weaponization of healthcare in context where conflict parties use violence against civilians as their war tactic. That we find ways of adhering to the humanitarian principles while recognizing that some conflict parties are not prepared to do the same. In these contexts, aid is truly under fire. And at the moment, we don't really have the right tools to effectively protect local health workers and health system as part of our aid efforts. And the consequence are rising civilian death from avoidable deaths and a tremendous mental and physical toll on health workers. Thank you very much for your attention, and I wish I could have been in the room with you today. I wish you a good continuation of the conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed to Christina. When she's not well, but she's provided that for us. And I mean, that the theme there again coming through of connecting voices, connecting the dots, is partnership that's needed. Really, really important. But obviously very disturbing when you hear that, even that phrase, the weaponization of healthcare, really, really disturbing. And I think that's something that our next speaker, Claude Mon, will be very aware of as the director of MSF's International Legal Department. So I know that MSF, like other groups, has been directly exposed to attacks on its staff. So we really want to know from you, Claude, what action can be taken, including implementing Security Council Resolution 2286, which says that all parties to armed conflicts should facilitate safe and unimpeded passage for medical personnel and humanitarian personnel, and it's not happening. So, Claude.
Thank you, Cathy, and thank you for inviting me to share MSF's perspective on this issue, which is obviously of critical importance for us. More than half of MSF's project worldwide take place in either a situation of armed conflict, where IHL is applicable, or in other situations of violence. In this challenging operational environment, and despite the heralded international political reaffirmation of the protection of the medical mission in UN Security Council Resolution 2286, attacks on medical care continue for MSF at even more alarming levels and places than before. Since 2015, we have marked the loss of 26 MSF staff in 10 separate events. Over the last 5 years, our staff have lost their lives in Ethiopia, in Afghanistan, in South Sudan, in Syria, in Yemen, and in Central African Republic. We have also experienced an evolution of the types of attack on medical mission, and indeed on how we understand the concept of attack itself. We have witnessed a shift from massive bombings, Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, to more pervasive but equally detrimental attacks represented by violence, harassment, intimidation of medical personnel in health structures and ambulances, Cameroon, DRC, Central African Republic, by state and non-state actors alike. While less spectacular somehow and less visible on the international stage, this violence threatens the security of our personnel and the respect of our mission, our patients, and our structures. Unfortunately, in certain projects, these consistent but perceived low-level attacks has become business as usual, and that slowly and deliberately suffocates humanitarian and medical action for people in need. Within MSF, this shift in understanding what constitutes an attack is underway. Recent incidents have compelled us to recognize the need to better understand arrests and detention incidents. In the last 20 years, 63 incidents of arrest and detention were recorded in 26 different countries. Our national colleagues pay the heaviest price for this, being detained sometimes in average 6 times longer than expatriate staff, and with incidents likely to be underreported via formal reporting channels, likely due to a normalization of harassment and violence. This is not and should not become the new norm, and it should not be tolerated by international community. In a recently published MSF research report on the experience of MSF frontline medical workers in counterterrorism environments, 70% of the interviewees said that they had been subject to violence, to intimidation, as a direct result of providing treatment to patients considered as terrorists. These indeed included accusation of supporting terrorists, as well as curses, insults, beatings, and in some cases, forced entry to facilities by armed force. Like the onslaught of aerial bombings on medical structures that triggered political action, culminating in Resolution 2286, these everyday violences must also be addressed if we, in this forum, we want to act to better protect our colleagues. MSF is developing more precise data and typologies on such incidents to better understand these overlooked type of attacks in the complex and dangerous environments. With this, we hope to be in a better position to decipher and act on early warning signs that our medical and humanitarian activity and our colleagues who deliver it to the population are no longer protected. From a legal perspective, the erosion of IHL protection and principles is plain to see in the applicable legal frameworks, notably in situations of NIAC or in the other situations of violence. Whilst humanitarian action is never explicitly criminalized in domestic laws, such as counterterrorism laws, the silence of these laws allow for the perception of the illegitimacy of humanitarian and medical action to criminal or terrorist individuals or groups to germ and take hold. In other words, the omissions of states to reassert the legitimacy of impartial medical care to all in their domestic laws has resulted in the undermining of these protective legal frameworks and indeed in their obligation to respect and to ensure respect of IHL. Allowing medical treatment to the enemy in situation of armed conflict is the cornerstone of IHL protection, and it was the first battle to be won and an agreement reached to enable impartial medical care to be provided, and that such care is a neutral act. This should remain the case, regardless of how the enemy is labeled. Resolution 2286 clarified the structural framework for protection of the medical mission that was an existential necessity more than 5 years ago for MSF actually to continue being able to work in conflict areas. What we need now is the clarification of its application, not just in some, but in all contexts of armed conflict, including in NIAC, and particularly those labeled as wars on terrors. The risk of not clarifying the intention of scope of this application is too high for our patient and for our staff. Ladies and gentlemen, I urge you to keep at the fore of this forum and to recall that the criminalization of humanitarian work first and foremost affects our staff who experience the real and very grave fallout when medical and humanitarian action is no longer perceived to be legitimate and neutral act. So what action can be taken to improve the protection of all humanitarian staff? I'd like to present 4 recommendations. My fellow esteemed speakers have spoken already this morning also about the issue of accountability for attacks against humanitarian workers. And when it comes to accountability, we often hear needs for the creation of new international mechanism or investigation. Let's be honest also. These mechanisms charged with investigating massive violation of IHL will always come up against obstacles and resistance to be activated, to conduct investigations and to implement their recommendations. I believe we should focus on what exists already, but which is often forgotten or not used. Firstly, the primary responsibility rests with national jurisdiction, civil or military, and these should not be overlooked. International mechanisms do exist as well. For example, the International Humanitarian Fact-Finding Commission, the HIFFC. While far from being perfect, it is established in international humanitarian law already, with a specific and relevant mandate which should be reinforced and improved instead of being dismissed and replaced with new structures which would likely be facing unbearable challenges in today's international context. In addition to requesting independent, impartial investigation of each incident that rarely gain any traction, MSF is engaged also in the active internal investigation of each incident in line with international standards. Establishing internally the facts of such incidents is crucial for MSF to constructively engage with and challenge national and international authorities in the pursuit of the judicial truth and accountability. We would like to see greater use of internal investigation to challenge the often used narrative of mistakes or collateral damage in the fog of war. The findings of internal investigation might not be admissible in any potential criminal proceedings. However, internal fact-finding should be recognized as a means to activate and inform other independent, impartial national or international investigation for accountability purposes. Of course, another concrete measures, and one that MSF and other humanitarian organizations have been imploring states for years, is to reinforce the national legislative frameworks and to ensure that all impartial humanitarian and medical activities are excluded from the scope of application of counterterrorism and sanction measures. This is essentially the continuation of work of Resolution 2286, and the request is clear. We need standing humanitarian exemptions in domestic legislation, in operational paragraphs of international and regional resolution and directives, in operational paragraphs of international and regional sanction regimes. Not ad hoc derogations or exceptions granted on a case-by-case basis that are not a functional solution to manage humanitarian operational needs, nor a viable one, as it does not create the certainty required to ensure the security of our medical activities. Finally, humanitarian organizations should continue internally redefining what is an attack, what an attack is, and exploring how to define incidents that reduce the capacity of humanitarian actors to act in accordance with humanitarian principles and to develop more adapted typologies to address this challenge. Ladies and gentlemen, only with this concrete action will we arrive at the operationalization of the principles that were first entrenched in IHL and then reaffirmed by 2286 resolution. European countries must take the lead in demonstrating the commitment to the protection of medical mission in armed conflict and take resolution 2286 to its logical and necessary conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So another plea for real accountability and a commitment to fight impunity. So thank you, Claude. Just to remind you, we won't have a lot of time for questions, but the Slido code is EHF-AB, which is the name of this room, if you do want to send a question. So our final speaker is Nick Lee. He is the Executive Director of INSO, which is the International NGO Safety Organization. So basically making security assessments of situations, and I know you've worked in many complex situations, many years in Afghanistan. So the question we want to ask you, I know you've been very involved in the discussion series throughout the whole process. So how do we build on that? And particularly, I know that your organization has been working on data collection and field level services. So tell us some more, Nick.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kathy. And Reka, thank you. I see you've already posted the links to the Slido there. So the purpose of this session really is to follow up on concrete outcomes from the discussion series that occurred last year, and I think we've had very, very robust and passionate support and defences, particularly for the IHL finding from that, or the IHL recommendation from that around the overall protection of aid workers. I'm going to focus on two other ones. For those that don't know INSO, as Kathy said, we're a safety coordinating body for NGOs operating in high-risk countries. So we've been very engaged around recommendation 2, which is really around common humanitarian database, let's say, and recommendation 3, which is around support based in the field, particularly to local NGOs as well. So that's what I want to talk about today. I'll take them in reverse order, and I'm really going to try to focus on practical outcomes, so actual results that we can move towards. So the first in relation to recommendation 3, which came out of the discussion series, which was really to prioritize the delivery of practical safety services in the field. As far as I'm concerned, this is already in place through INSO platforms. But it's only in place in 14 of the highest risk countries in the world. But those 14 countries are where around 90% of NGO incidents are occurring. If you want to see where they are, you can go on our website and see a map, but basically everything from Afghanistan to Mali. So we already have in place direct support platforms in the highest risk countries. There are 2 new ones underway at the moment, which are Mozambique and Haiti. And 4 more lined up just behind those for Lebanon, Libya, Sudan, and Ethiopia. Yemen is missing from the picture at the moment, but it's on our radar and certainly something we want to get to grips with as soon as we can. There's a general basic crisis response system available through INSO. For example, that's ramping up at the moment with Ukraine, obviously. And I think, you know, all of these platforms provide precisely the type of support that is envisioned in the outcomes document in terms of real-time flash alerts, orientations, training, analytical pieces, and most importantly, it's equally available to national and international NGOs. This is fully funded activity already, DG ECHO being the main supporter of this, along with BHA, USAID, and plenty of ministries of member states. Germany is a big contributor, Norway is a big contributor, Switzerland's a big contributor. So in sum, I think, you know, for R3, this is active and effective, I would say, but at the moment, only 16 out of 23 high priority countries. The 2 outstanding questions on recommendation 3, from my perspective, are, is it necessary or desirable for us to extend this level of field support to every country where NGOs operate? If not, what's the limit? And in my view, it's not really necessary everywhere. The second question in relation to that recommendation is really, are we comfortable with field support being provided on an ad hoc, you know, year-by-year basis? So at the moment, in order to maintain that level of field support, INSO as an organization has to renew grants and applications for every single one of those countries individually every single year. So it's not necessarily the most sustainable way to do it. Coming now to recommendation 2, which I think is, you know, potentially the more prominent one from the discussion series. If you look in the Slido, Reka has shared a link to a project that we've been working on for the last 5 years. It is called the CHDC, the Conflict and Humanitarian Data Center. This is a project that has been supported by a number of member states, Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland, Norway, plus UK and Canada have supported us to develop precisely this tool for precisely this purpose. So the conversation around a common humanitarian database was going on many years before the discussion series picked it up, but it's really nice to see it elevated to that level and get the traction around it. So CHDC is basically developed, and it is exactly what is called for within the discussion series. Also, it's a comprehensive database that contains all of the incidents that are recorded by INSO across all of the field platforms. So it includes all of the incidents affecting NGOs, but also every other incident that we record within those contexts as well. So individual incident data is categorized by actors, so perpetrators, victims, type of acts, type of impact, lives lost, people abducted, property destroyed, so on and so forth, with a very detailed geolocation, temporal location as well, down to a kind of settlement level within each country. So an important announcement is that we will actually make this database available to all partners by the 1st of April. So it's only like 10 days away. If you log into the system now, you'll kind of see a preview demo of it. But to all INSO registered partners, you'll get an email on the 1st of April that allows you to log directly into this system by the 1st of April, and you'll have permanent access to it from then on. And for those that aren't registered with INSO, we've actually, on our own website, we've put up 2 dashboards now, a conflict dashboard and an NGO incident dashboard that will be publicly available from now on. They're both on our website as well, and Reka has posted the links. These draw directly from CHDC. So if you're a researcher, a journalist, an academic or so, and you don't have direct access to CHDC, you can get the top-line data from there as well. So I think, in sum, we certainly expect CHDC to meet the needs of outcome recommendation number 2 in terms of providing a platform, the information platform. Whereas, the only real question I have outstanding there is whether we consider it necessary to extend the scope of CHDC to cover countries that INSO isn't physically working in. And, to say we've had ongoing discussions with both our core donors group, but also with DG ECHO around the scope of CHDC and how wide that information footprint needs to go. I think, tying those 2 things together, it's really important to say that they go hand in hand. You cannot have reliable global data without field presence, and field presence must be informed by reliable global data. So to us, we have always tied these 2 things together, and INSO's always aimed to pursue both the field presence that serves as the collection mechanism, as well as the distribution of services and support at a field level, tying that to the global data set. So with 45 seconds, just to make 2 recommendations, really this is addressed kind of to member states, but also to the NGOs in the room and others. The first is just continued support to our own field operations. These are really the only resource, particularly that local NGOs have, in terms of equal access to training, orientation, capacity building, and alerts. And we would ask all of your support, please, in making sure that when CHDC is launched on the 1st of April, it becomes quickly and widely adopted as a global resource. Certainly there will be development periods we'll have to go through from now on, but once it's there, I fully intend to do more engagement, to pick up its development. The second one is that I wanted to propose concretely an operational roundtable meeting. We're keen to do this. Like I said, we have different strands of conversations going on at the moment, some with DG ECHO, some with BHA USAID, some with our core donors. I would use this forum to invite BHA, DG ECHO, and our core donors to an operational meeting some point this summer to work with us to work out these final questions around what should be the scope of field platforms under Outcome 3 and centralized data under Outcome 2. I'll finish there, and just to say that the demo account for CHDC will be live until 12 o'clock CET today. After that, the password will be deactivated, and only those of you that are registered in INSO's Partners Portal will have access from the 1st of April. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. A really interesting sounding resource, so very wonderful. Time, of course, is just running away with us. We've got 3 very, very short interventions from other people. So first of all, Daniel Beck is with us here. He's the Deputy Head of Division for the German Federal Foreign Office, the Division for International Humanitarian Organizations and Multilateral Policy on Humanitarian Assistance. Where are you, Daniel? Could you face the camera so that everybody can see? Oh, you've got a camera there. That's fine. That's fine.
I got a camera here, yes.
Okay.
if that works. Yes, that works. Thank you very much, Kathy, and to the impressive panel, certainly as well. I just wanted to make a quick comment here on behalf of the German government, and basically also in line with what we heard from Spain already just now. It's really good that this important topic really runs through the whole forum, the protection of humanitarian space here. And that is actually that was the reason why our minister also came here yesterday to underline that point, that this is an important priority for our foreign policy, especially in these days with the context of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. This becomes so much more necessary. And that's why I wanted to make just 3 quick points here. The first, obviously, is the one that we have our commitments laid out in the humanitarian call for action, which was discussed yesterday in the ministerial meeting as well by our minister and, of course, the French minister as well, which specifically actually also mentions and refers to resolution 2286. And here I think we have, from that, basically on that level of what states can do, a concrete tool for the protection of humanitarian space. We're implementing these commitments here, for instance, through funding a number of organizations which work directly, looking at INSO here as well. And we are also reaching out to many other states to support this call for action, which has 52 state parties, state signatories for the time being, plus the European Union. There's still a little bit of, let's say, room, and that's why we, of course, also call out for everyone, especially to all EU member states. There are actually 3 outstanding still, to also join this call. Secondly, as has been mentioned, this is also for the EU member states to strengthen our coordination on IHL. We're working here on this. I think we still think we have to make sure that before looking at new coordination mechanisms, we have to make sure that we take a close look at existing instruments here on the table. And thirdly, this is also true for monitoring mechanisms. We've heard from Insecurity Insights and from Nick just now that there are already NGOs out there who specialize and focus on these issues. And of course also we heard all the impressive voices from you in particular here on this really impressive panel, as I said. And we should use these existing mechanisms and avoid duplication of structures. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. So we have two more very, very quick interventions. Selina Victor, I think, is going to join us on WhatsApp because Zoom is a problem. Senior Director for Policy and Advocacy for Mercy Corps Europe. Selina, are you with us? If not, we will move on to our next external speaker, who is Andre Krumacher, the Vice CEO of Programs for Impact and Accountability at ACTID. Yes, we have Andre with us. 2 minutes,
Thank
Andre,
you,
no more. We're running out of time.
Yes, I will be very quick. Thank you so much. And first of all, thanks to the European Commission and France for organizing this important event and having a dedicated session on the protection of humanitarian workers and the fight against impunity. A lot has been said by the panelists already, and I'm pleased to see that so much reflection is going into this crucial issue. Because the international community is unable to agree on much these days, however, we believe that there should be a short and a long-term agenda to this issue. In the short term, we think that it would be most useful for aid organizations, states, and other concerned stakeholders to take a number of pragmatic steps. We have heard many interesting ideas and what such steps may look like, and we would like to contribute a few of our own. Firstly, we think that it would be important to bring aid actors and other concerned stakeholders together to reflect on how to improve the tracking of attacks against humanitarians and their perpetrators, with a view to facilitate future prosecution and improve our ability to influence decision makers. One of the ideas would be the creation of a dedicated center tasked with both gathering evidence of attacks against humanitarian workers as well as furthering the cause of ending impunity in other ways. Secondly, we note with some concerns that the new position of a special advisor on access and humanitarian negotiations announced by the UN Secretary General in 2021 following successful collective advocacy by NGOs has not yet been created. Apparently as a result of a lack of consensus within the Fifth Committee of the General Assembly, which must approve all such senior positions. We therefore would like to urge EU member states to work with ODHR and other member states to find a way out of this so that this important post can be finally created, and to ensure that once created, the special advisor has a dedicated focus on the protection of humanitarian workers and the fight against impunity, and not only on access. And finally, as most attacks against humanitarian workers take place in conflict context and are carried out by parties to conflicts, we would like to see the EU include violations of IHL as a trigger for its own sanctions mechanism alongside international human rights law. In the longer term, we should continue to put pressure on UN member states to overcome their disunity and take determined action at the multilateral level to improve the protection of humanitarian workers and fight against impunity of perpetrators of crimes against humanitarians. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Selina apparently is back with us from Mercy Corps Europe. Selina?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Sorry about that.
Just very briefly, I'm afraid, because we haven't got much time.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for this opportunity to feed in on this important topic. Mercy Corps has been working in Syria for the last decade, where Syrian humanitarian workers are the backbone of the aid response, as they are in so many of the crises that we're responding to, including Ukraine. They're risking their lives on a daily basis to provide aid based on need and in accordance with the humanitarian principles. Even in the midst of mass displacement, local humanitarian workers are staying and continuing to operate. In 2018, Mercy Corps undertook a series of discussions to understand Syrian humanitarian workers' challenges and outcomes and concerns. And what we found, I think, is still incredibly relevant today. They face greater risks. Not only do they risk being caught in the crossfire, they risk being targeted because of their role in civil society. There were many cases of attacks, but also of questioning, harassment, arrest, detention, or forcible relocations or conscription of individuals because of their affiliation with humanitarian work. They were particularly at risk during periods of transfer of control from opposition to Syrian government, when it was particularly difficult to provide any kind of oversight or protection. Secondly, they received less support for security risk management. They didn't always participate in the deconfliction system. Incident reporting did not always include them. And this appears to be partly because of lack of time, lack of capacity, but partly because of lack of trust in the system, fear that reporting would at best be fruitless or at worst be dangerous. Safety and security trainings were not always extended to national staff and partners, or they didn't have time and capacity to participate. Situation analysis to inform decision-making was only shared in English. Third, Syrian humanitarian workers did not benefit from the same duty of care benefits as UN and INGO staff, whether that be salary advances for forcible relocation and other benefits. In 2018, we agreed as a community that NGOs and UN would have common standards of duty of care for staff inside Syria and a shared package of financial and non-financial benefits. We need to take those same measures to ensure that local partners and national actors have that same kind of support, and that needs to be funded. And finally, Syrian humanitarian workers didn't receive the same opportunity of justice and accountability as internationals might. This is a wider problem. We all know that the challenges of having accountability for attacks on humanitarian workers around standardized, proper documentation, follow-up and investigation of attacks. As we move to improve that, that needs to be for all incidents, not just those affecting the UN or INGO staff. Obviously, this was from Syria, but I just wanted to say that the three things that came up again and again, and I think we need to consider as we go forward, is inclusion of national staff, them having the resources to participate, and trust, which is the absolutely key one.
Thank you very much indeed, Selina. We'll have to stop you there, but thank you so much. some really important points, and I'm so sorry to have to rush through all this, but just really to conclude, I want to ask you all, I mean, there is not a lot of time, but just in 15, 30 seconds, what is the most important thing that needs to happen? It'll be something you've already said, or maybe there's something you just need to pick up very briefly from what another of the speakers has said. But you know, what have we got to get right to really tackle this issue? What would you say, Iman?
Very quickly and in a few words, I think I'd like to call on all parties to consider equal and inclusive duty of care policies, equal and inclusive. Thank you.
Nick, equal and inclusive.
So, one of the founders of modern organizational management theory, the great Peter Drucker, Austrian-American, was once quoted as saying that ideas don't move mountains, bulldozers do. I think the outcome document gave us a lot of ideas, but if we don't break out the bulldozers, we're not going to get very far.
Right, get building, okay. Get digging and building. Jean-François.
Wow, you're so right. No, political will.
Yeah.
Because bulldozers are driven by will also. You know, if you want to drive the bulldozer, we can achieve it. If they don't want, there is no way.
We'll keep this analogy going all the way, the bulldozers.
I'm going to break that one, sorry. I think we should bring humanitarian and legal organisations together. Let's identify the legal barriers, look what tools we already have, and let's start taking some action, including legal cases together.
But I mean, this action is the theme, yes.
Thank you. As a donor, I've been taking a lot of notes. So I guess most of the recommendations is for me in the panel. I would say three things. One, we talk about the data. I think it is important, and that's a starting point. Number two, I would say an unwavering resolve to uphold international humanitarian law. That's not just our obligation as member states of the UN, but it's also the best way of protecting people on the ground. And I think that's, and I would leave it at that. Thanks.
Claude.
I think I would repeat one of the things I said, which is that we have at the moment a possibility to engage, to push for the acceptance and the vote by the states for standing humanitarian exemption into counterterrorism national laws, which is one of the main threats today for humanitarian workers on the field. And I can urge you. I can't say more, but it's so important, and we repeat it constantly because this is the main concrete things we can do at the moment.
Thank you very much indeed. Esther from UNDSS, who we heard from early on, was not able to stay with us for the rest of the event, so she sends her apologies, but we heard her views earlier. But thank you all very much indeed, because I mean, the passion that has come from this panel is there. I'm sorry we've had to rush everything. We haven't had time for much discussion, but I think that some really great points were made, and I think, you know, that, yeah, I mean, it is this sense that action is needed, and you've got the basis for it. It's now moving on from there. But I think a round of applause for our speakers, please. There were so many questions that I wanted to get into and discuss more, but never mind. It's the frustration of the conference setting and the restrictions. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Thank you for watching remotely, and enjoy the rest of the day and the rest of the sessions. Thank you.